Yo, what's up guys? This video is going to be a comprehensive guide about everything to do with underflicking. Underflicking recently has had a huge surge in popularity for being a premium technique that top static aimers have been utilizing, but even with this popularity, there isn't a clear demonstration on how to bridge the knowledge these top players have been sharing about underflicking into a practical application. So in this video, I'm going to walk us through everything about the underflick and share the blueprint to integrate into our own aim. So with the regular static aiming technique, we use the initial flick primarily as a method to shorten the distance between our crosshair and the target. So this naturally means we are aiming the initial flick directly at the target, and then our micro correction, as the name itself implies, can correct the mistakes we make during the initial flick. But because the initial flick requires high tension, to create an explosive movement with our mouse, there's a trade-off with a reduction in our precision to acquire that fast mouse movement, which makes the initial flick a volatile aiming technique where any minimal mouse movements can completely change the direction and distance of the landing of our crosshair. And this characteristic of the initial flick is the fundamental flaw with aiming directly at the target. As we flick directly at the target, there are three possible outcomes that can occur based on the positioning of our crosshair that lands relative to the target. The intended outcome of landing directly on the target, landing short of the target, which is an underflick, or landing past the target, which is an overflick. But as mentioned before, because of the volatility of the initial flick mechanic and the three possible outcomes of the initial flick congregating very tightly around the target itself, we are put in a vulnerable position where the outcome of the initial flick is unpredictable because there is not much room for error. And this is problematic specifically for the following micro correction step of the static flick. The micro correction aspect of the static flick is like a checkpoint where we need to know where our crosshair has landed before we continue progressing through to the rest of the static flick technique. But the unpredictability of the initial flick can cause a stall before the micro correction, as we eat up a lot of time trying to visually acquire where our crosshair has landed to confirm whether we have landed on the target, underflicked, or overflicked. So what top static aimers have been doing instead to circumvent the disadvantages of the initial flick being unpredictable is to redirect where they aim their initial flick to purposely stop in the space before the target to cause an intentional underflick. This approach of intentionally underflicking gives more leniency for mistakes because the area to land an underflick is isolated away from the other initial flick outcomes, and the area itself to land an underflick is significantly larger in comparison to landing on the area of the target. And being able to dictate the results of our initial flick more effectively removes the previous double checking action before the micro correction, because the intended outcome of our initial flick being an underflick will more reliably occur, allowing us to better prepare and anticipate in advance what application of micro correction will be needed and helping streamline the overall process of our static flick. Alright, so that's all the theory behind the concept of underflicking. Let's finally learn how to actually underflick. What we want to do is open up AimLabs and hop into VT 5-shot intermediate and complete a full run of this scenario. Our main goal here is to get a fair representation of our current skills, so play through the scenario with how we would naturally aim and try to finish a run that we would consider to be 85 to 95% of what we are capable of. And once we've finished that run, what we are then going to do is review our run through the replay system. What we are trying to look for are the overflicks, and more specifically the distance away from the target that those overflicks are stopping at. What this should do is give us an impression of how large the accuracy spread of our initial flicks are, and this is important because it plays a vital role in determining the optimal positioning of where we will be aiming our underflicks. So for example, right here between the target and the red part of the curve, I'd say I overflicked roughly 2 targets wide. And then again here, I'd say I'd measure the distance here to probably be 1.5 targets wide. And I'm just going to be continuously doing this throughout the whole entire replay. Alright, so we've gone through the whole replay, and the average distance I'm overflicking is roughly 1.5 targets wide of the actual target. To keep this video concise, this is essentially the radius for our initial flick spread, and is now also the distance we will be measuring out to underflick behind the target. It's important to put this amount of effort into figuring out the spread because to be able to properly execute an effective underflick, we need to land close enough to the target to be within micro correction range of the target, but also distance our initial flick landing away from the middle of the target to remove the possibility of overflicking. So now that we've learned the optimal distance we should be aiming for when we are intentionally underflicking, we need to start practicing and integrating it into our own aim. So what's going to be happening initially is that there will be an adjustment period where during our flicks there will be a slight pause because we are going to be aiming at each target twice. Once at the actual target itself, and another at the space behind the target after measuring out the distance we just worked out to underflick. And so until we get to the point where we are no longer pausing to consciously measure out the distance of our underflick, we want to completely avoid practicing on regular static scenarios. Instead, we want to be only using Pokeball scenarios. This type of scenario in general is a powerful practice tool to help implement and practice new techniques. Pokeball is very beneficial during the initial experimentation stage of learning to unflick because the unique regenerative health target mechanic helps visually communicate in real time the quality of the actions in each flick after every target we eliminate, which is super useful especially when implementing a new technique as it helps us associate what the perfect underflick should look and feel like each time we get a successful Pokeball kill. So in terms of the selection of Pokeball scenarios, the first thing we want to prioritize with underflicking is getting practice shortening the expected amount of distance we want our initial flick to travel. So in general, any Pokeball scenario is fine, but the perfect scenario conditions would be something with wide spawns to actually force us to perform initial flicks, and preferably having a target count between 3 to 6 targets. Examples of the ideal Pokeball scenarios with these qualities would be Pokeball Frenzy Auto Small, Pokeball Frenzy Auto 1 War 6 target small, and Pokeball Frenzy Auto 1 War 4 target small. And so the next thing we want to practice is maintaining the same underflicking distance regardless of the size of the target. When we perform our initial flicks with the standard static technique where we aim directly at the target, the sizing of the target forces differing levels of precision of the initial flick because the area we want to land our flick can grow or shrink in size. But now, since we are aiming at the space behind the target, the size of the target being larger or smaller has no impact on the distance we are aiming at underflick, meaning the initial flick should remain unaffected by the target size. So by practicing keeping the distance we underflick the target consistent, it will help reaffirm the universal application of our underflick. We want Pokeball scenarios with differing sized targets, so I recommend RX 1 or 6 target small varied Pokeball, RX multi-click Pokeball, and VT multi-click 120 intermediate Pokeball as good examples. Once we've spent a bit of time and become fully accustomed to the two changes with implementing the new approach and how we perform our initial flick, we've finally finished the integration phase of the underflick, and now we can start comfortably applying it to actual static scenarios. And to note if we've fully integrated this new underflicking technique, a rough guideline would be when we have full comfort with the underflick, where the action of what is essentially missing the target is now done subconsciously. Another good indicator to show if we are fully comfortable is when we do play actual static scenarios, we are performing at roughly the same or at a better level of performance than we were with our previous static technique. The reason why this is the standard is because implementing the purposeful underflick itself, whilst it isn't an objective improvement over aiming our initial flick directly at the target, it is the reconfiguration of the initial flick that offers better risk management, and that itself improves consistency and makes the mechanical process of the flick easier to perform, which should be resulting in better scores. So we've finished learning how to underflick and we can perform it naturally, but as mentioned before, we've only reconfigured the form of our initial flick. We haven't done any actual specific training to improve the initial flick yet. So what direction should we take to refine this technique to match the skill level of the other parts of our static game? I strongly recommend improving the underflick by reducing the accuracy spread of the initial flick. Through becoming more accurate with our precision, we can limit the variance in the landing of our initial flicks, which can then allow us to position our underflicks closer to the target because we are less likely to cause an overflick. By improving the accuracy of our technique, it will naturally cause the execution of the whole static flick itself to be performed faster as a result of being more effective with our mouse movements. The reason why improving the speed of the initial flick first is worse in comparison is that pushing the pace causes instability and will actually increase the spread of our initial flick landings, meaning we have to move further away from the target because we can't mitigate the possibility of an overflick as effectively anymore. Now you've probably noticed a lot of contradiction with the technique we've just gone over and the VOD shown in the background. My aim looks sloppy because visually it looks really cluttered and it doesn't even seem like I'm following my own advice on how to underflick and instead flicking directly at the target. And this is why we should be selective with whose VODs we are watching if we want to study, compare, or even imitate the aiming techniques from, because it's impossible to read the intention of the player through VODs alone. In my static VODs, I'm still relying on the fundamental values from intentionally underflicking, But because of the level of my mechanical skill, I don't value the guaranteed consistency underflicking provides as highly as I would if I were a lower skilled player. So I'm actually playing more recklessly and taking on more risk by aiming my underflick a lot closer to the target and causing myself to occasionally overflick. But without knowing this, because there is no sense of stability or consistency with the technique, it's impossible to pinpoint what my actual intentions are. And if we copy a technique without knowing the reasoning behind the mouse movements, we can potentially harm our own understanding of the relative category of aiming, and also be influenced to perform with a fundamentally suboptimal shell of someone else's technique.